Hello, my name is Mir Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. I want to start with an observation that sounds wrong the first time you hear it, but it's a truth I see in systems every day. High performance is often the first signal that your system is failing. It isn't low performance, obvious chaos, or visible dysfunction that should worry you most. It's the high performance. Because if you look closely at modern corporate and tech environments, the people who seem the most engaged are often the ones absorbing the most structural damage. You see full calendars, fast replies, and strong delivery alongside an active team's presence and good energy in meetings. Underneath that surface of productivity, however, something else is happening that the dashboards don't catch. Trust is thinning, connection is narrowing, and resilience is dropping. This episode is not about loneliness as a personal issue or a lack of character. It's about loneliness as a system outcome. I want to trace how workflow design, collaboration patterns, and digital operating habits quietly produce isolation inside high-functioning teams. Because if we miss that structural reality, leaders will keep optimizing the same failure until the system finally breaks. Let me start by describing a team that looked perfectly healthy from the outside. The team that looked fine. A while ago, I was looking at a team inside a larger enterprise that sat right in that 3,000 to 8,000 employee range. This wasn't a struggling startup or a broken department, but a real established organization with a standard hybrid setup. They lived in the Microsoft 365 stack with Teams and Outlook running all day, supported by shared files, planner boards, and a few Power Platform solutions. From the outside, this team looked exactly like what most leaders say they want. They were reliable, they were responsive, they had low drama, they had strong output. Because they were in a growth phase, the pressure was high and the language of modern management was everywhere. The mandate was to move faster, reduce friction, and use Copilot to automate the repetitive work. Management wanted more efficiency and more results from the same headcount, which is the standard expectation in our current business reality. On paper, the team looked incredibly healthy. Delivery was strong, messages were being answered quickly, and every meeting was full of people moving the needle. If you looked at visible activity, you would have said the team was engaged and the culture was thriving. That's where this gets interesting. The system was showing signs of strength, but the people inside it were starting to lose something that no data point could see. The first signal was simple. Everyone was reachable, but fewer people were actually in contact. That sounds like a small distinction, but it matters deeply for structural resilience. There's a massive difference between a team that communicates a lot and a team that is actually connected, because one is just activity while the other is infrastructure. This team had plenty of activity. Calendars were packed, Teams notifications kept firing, and threads stayed active with people responding at lightning speed. If a leader needed a status update, it appeared immediately, and if a problem surfaced, someone jumped in to fix it. But the informal layer of the system had started to disappear. There were fewer side conversations and less spontaneous thinking across team lines, which meant cross-functional curiosity was dying out. That low-pressure contact where trust usually gets built before it is actually needed was gone. Because the team was still delivering on its KPIs, nobody treated the silence as a warning sign. Actually, the leadership interpreted the silence as maturity. That's the trap. High-functioning teams can normalize unhealthy design for a very long time because competent people are great at compensating for structural gaps. They carry the context in their heads, they translate between groups, and they join one more call to smooth over unclear ownership. They absorb the fragmentation of the digital workspace and make it look manageable to their bosses. The team looked connected in motion, but they weren't connected in relationship. Once you see that distinction, the rest of the pattern becomes obvious. People were collaborating mostly inside their closest working circles, where the trusted few still moved quickly together. Outside those immediate ties, the organization was getting thinner and visibility across adjacent teams was dropping. Knowledge was becoming local, informal learning was slowing down, and newer employees had no natural entry points into the real flow of work. The work still moved. But it moved through narrower trust paths. This is a problem because narrow trust paths create massive dependency, and dependency always looks efficient right up until the moment of a single point of failure. I remember looking at these signs and realizing this wasn't a motivation issue or a vague culture problem. It was an architectural issue. The environment was producing a very specific kind of behavior. Stay responsive, keep up, solve locally. Don't add friction. When those become the unwritten rules, people stop investing in the slower, less measurable forms of connection that make teams durable. They don't stop because they're lazy or they don't care. They stop because the system rewards speed over redundancy. So yes, the team looked fine. It looked productive, modern, and digitally mature. But underneath that polished surface, the system was getting more fragile by the month. And why is that? Because the metrics they were watching were the wrong ones. What leaders saw versus what was actually happening. What leaders saw was movement, and in most organizations, movement is frequently mistaken for health. They watched message volumes climb and assumed it meant engagement was high, just as they saw packed calendars and labeled it collaboration. When people stayed visible on Teams, fired off quick replies in Outlook, and kept their task lists moving, it looked like a deep commitment to the mission. From an operational distance, the logic seemed sound because the team was active, responsive, and producing results, so the conclusion felt obvious: things were working. But here is the thing that most of those leaders missed. What they were actually witnessing was communication density rather than connection quality, and those two things are not the same at all. Communication density simply tells you how much traffic is moving through your digital pipes, while connection quality tells you if the people inside that traffic actually trust and understand one another. When quality is high, people can think together without wasting energy on constant translation or defensive alignment, but this team was losing that shared context even as their message counts rose. Once shared context starts to drop, a subtle and dangerous shift occurs where work becomes purely transactional. Updates begin to replace real conversations, status reports take the place of collective sense-making, and people stop building a shared understanding to instead hand each other disconnected fragments. This is the hidden swap that happens in modern offices. From the outside, the organization looks more connected because there is more visible noise, but from the inside it feels isolated because that noise carries very little relationship or usable context. Leaders were essentially reading speed as a sign of cohesion, but that speed was actually being generated by individual compensation. A few key people knew exactly who to call to get things done, others knew how to decode vague requests from leadership, and a handful of veterans knew where the real answers lived when the official systems failed. Because these individuals were talented and dedicated, the machine kept moving, but the team wasn't actually collaborating more. They were coordinating more, and that distinction is where the real cost of the system starts to show up. Collaboration means we are thinking together to create new capacity, while coordination means we are spending our limited energy just trying to make fragmented work line up. In many hybrid and tool-heavy environments, coordination quietly expands, while leadership continues to call it collaboration. You can see this clearly in the daily rhythm of the work, specifically in the pre-meetings before the actual meeting and the follow-up calls required to explain what was just decided. When you see side messages flying to clarify a shared call or people acting as human interpreters between departments, you are seeing a system in trouble. The dashboard might say communication is healthy, but the lived reality is that people now need more touches to finish the same amount of work. This isn't a sign of a stronger team. It is a clear signal that trust and context have become expensive. Once that happens, the people themselves become the integration layer for the company. They are forced to carry the institutional memory, the political nuances of who actually makes decisions, and the emotional buffering that keeps internal tensions from exploding into the open. While that kind of performance looks impressive on a quarterly review, it is structurally a form of debt. The team is essentially borrowing resilience from their own future health just to preserve the output of the present. Because the work still gets done, leadership rarely thinks to question the underlying design of the system. This is why high performers are actually the most dangerous people to read at a surface level, because they are experts at hiding systemic failure. High performers can absorb bad architecture much longer than the average employee, and they can operate in fragmented systems while looking perfectly composed. They compensate for missing clarity, weak onboarding, and thin trust without creating any obvious drama, but that doesn't mean the system is healthy. It just means the organization has found people willing to hold the pieces together manually, and manual resilience is a solution that never scales. The more the work became legible on a digital dashboard, the less the people doing that work were legible to each other. Activity and output were visible to the bosses, but the strain, the dependency, and the relational thinning remained completely hidden. Loneliness is a design output. Let me take one step back and explain the design logic that sits underneath all of this. When I talk about loneliness at work, I'm not using it as some soft or vague personal word, but rather as a description of a structural condition. It represents low connection across the entire system, weak redundancy in human relationships, and thin trust paths between different functions. Once those conditions exist for a long enough time, loneliness stops being a side effect and becomes a primary output of the organization. This distinction matters because most companies still treat loneliness as if it lives entirely inside the individual. They act as if one person is simply struggling to connect and suggest that the fix is more confidence, a wellness session, or a manager telling them to reach out more often. If you look closely at the architecture of the work, you realize that this framing completely misses the actual mechanism. People do not become isolated at scale by accident. They become isolated when workflows reward raw speed over reflection. Isolation happens when digital channels multiply faster than shared understanding and when trust gets trapped inside small closed groups. When the environment makes transactional contact effortless but real connection expensive, you aren't looking at a personality issue, you are looking at a system outcome. Once you label something a personal problem, you push the entire burden of fixing it back onto the individual. But when you see it as architecture, the questions you ask begin to change. From a systems perspective, loneliness looks exactly like fragile infrastructure. Imagine you build the fastest possible path between 2 points because it is efficient, clean, and highly optimized. If there is no failover, no alternate route, and no second person holding the context, that path will perform beautifully right up until the pressure changes. Then, because it has no buffering capacity or shared memory outside that direct line, the entire thing breaks. Human systems work in the exact same way. If all your important work flows through a few trusted people or a handful of private relationships, you haven't built a resilient team. You have built a socially compressed system that looks more efficient than it really is because it hides the massive risk of a single point of failure. High performers complicate this picture because they can survive inside this flawed design much longer than anyone else, often making the bad design look like a success. These are the people who keep the unwritten map in their heads and bridge teams that no longer naturally talk to each other. They smooth over missing processes with pure personal effort and absorb ambiguity without making a sound, which allows leadership to see stability where there is actually only exhaustion. Over time, this compensation becomes incredibly expensive as the high performer becomes the unofficial backup system and the emotional regulator for the entire group. The cost shows up as narrower trust, less openness, and a total loss of challenger safety within the team. The person is still functioning and delivering results, but the system is slowly converting their human energy into structural compensation. I want to be very careful about blame here, because this isn't about telling people they should care more or be more emotionally available. That kind of language sounds human, but it is structurally lazy because it asks people to solve with effort what the environment is producing by design. If your work model fragments context and rewards constant availability while localizing trust into tiny clusters, then loneliness is the expected result. The system is doing exactly what it was built to do, even if it wasn't built for what people actually need to sustain their performance over the long haul. Once we see loneliness as architecture instead of just an emotion, we can finally start to read the digital workplace differently. We can stop asking if communication is happening and start asking what kind of communication the system has made normal. We can stop focusing only on whether people are productive and start asking what that productivity is costing us in terms of trust and redundancy. This is where the conversation becomes vital for anyone making decisions about Microsoft 365 or operating models. Once you read loneliness as a design output, the entire technology stack starts to tell on itself. Pattern 1. Async overload. Once you look at loneliness as a design output, the first pattern in the system becomes impossible to ignore. I'm talking about async overload. On the surface, asynchronous work looks like pure progress because it gives us flexibility, reduces the constant pressure of meetings, and helps global teams move across time zones without losing momentum. It allows people to respond when they actually have the mental space instead of forcing every single decision into a real-time conversation. That part of the story is true, but here is the structural trade-off that most leaders miss. Async scales information perfectly, but it does not automatically scale human connection. In fact, if you push this model too far without redesigning the environment around it, the system starts doing the exact opposite of what you intended. It increases the number of contact points while simultaneously reducing the depth of those contacts, which means people are always in touch but rarely actually in contact. That is a very different operating condition for a human being. Inside Microsoft 365 environments, this usually shows up as a relentless, familiar rhythm of Teams messages, Outlook emails, mentions, and follow-up pings. You see reaction notifications, status checks, task comments, and shared document alerts piled on top of calendar reshuffles and Copilot summaries. Each one of these pings feels small and manageable by itself, but structurally, they do something much more significant. They fragment your attention into tiny pieces and spread your work across a much wider surface area than most people realize. The result is that instead of having one real conversation, you end up managing 6 partial ones. Instead of reaching one aligned decision, the process turns into a meeting, followed by a thread, then a side message, an email recap, and finally a follow-up because someone interpreted the text differently. From a dashboard view, this can still look healthy because there is plenty of activity and visible engagement, but the lived experience on the ground is completely different. People stop feeling like they are working with others and start feeling like they are simply servicing digital streams. This shift matters because streams do not create trust on their own. They only create demand. Now, let me be precise. Async itself is not the problem. The problem is overload without structure, where high-volume traffic meets weak norms, fuzzy boundaries, and poor context retention. That specific combination quietly pushes teams into a state of constant partial attention, where you are never fully in the work, yet you are never fully out of it either. You find yourself just adjacent to 10 different things at once. When people live in that condition for long enough, 2 things happen to the system. First, communication becomes shallower as messages get shorter, more tactical, and more defensive to keep up with the queue. People optimize for quick closure because the stream never stops moving, and when communication compresses like that, the emotional signal drops out entirely. Tone gets harder to read, intent becomes easier to misread, and small frictions grow faster because there is no relational context left to absorb them. Second, the system starts replacing reliability with mere availability. This is one of the most damaging swaps in modern work because a person who answers quickly is read as engaged and committed. But a fast response does not always mean a meaningful contribution. Often it just means the system has trained that person to stay permanently interruptible. And interruptibility is not resilience, it is exposure. This clicked for me when I started hearing the same sentence repeated across different teams. I'm talking to people all day, but I still feel disconnected. That is async overload in a single line. The person isn't lacking communication, they are lacking enough stable contextual interaction for trust to actually compound. Because hybrid work already weakens those accidental connections we used to rely on, overload makes the problem much worse. There is no recovery space where informal clarity can form, no hallway conversation after a tense meeting, and no 5-minute decompression with a colleague. The system simply moves on to the next ping before the meaning of the last one can even catch up. That is how we mistake responsiveness for connection. Over time, this erosion starts to bleed through our professional boundaries. Microsoft's research into the triple peak workday is useful here because it names the reality that work no longer has a single center of gravity. Messages spill into the early morning, the late evening, and every dead space in between until async flexibility turns into an ambient obligation. This doesn't happen because someone explicitly demanded it. It happens because the environment made permanent availability the safest way to adapt. The result is predictable. More handoffs, less trust, and a lot of exhaustion disguised as professionalism. Because high performers are usually the best at managing these fragmented flows, they are the ones who absorb the burden first. They become faster and more composed, but they also become significantly more isolated. But even then, the biggest issue isn't just the volume of work, it's the fragmentation of the system itself. Pattern 2, private channels and invisible work. Fragmentation is where the situation gets serious. Once a team is overloaded, it naturally starts looking for relief, and one of the fastest ways to find it in Microsoft 365 is through private channels and side chats. People start restricting groups and sharing documents only with the few people who really need to see them to move faster. To be fair, private spaces aren't inherently bad because sensitive work and leadership discussions will always exist. But here's the thing you have to watch for. What solves for local efficiency can quietly create global isolation across the rest of the company. That is exactly what happens when private channels stop being the exception and become the standard operating habit. At that point, the organization starts splitting into neighborhoods, small pockets of speed, trust, and context that feel great from the inside. Inside those pockets, people move quickly because they share a history and don't have to explain everything from scratch. But outside that pocket, everyone else sees less and understands less. This is the birth of invisible work. The official team space still exists, and the shared channels look active enough to satisfy the auditors, but the real work has drifted elsewhere. Decisions happen in side threads, and context sits in private notes, which means that when someone asks why a choice was made later on, nobody can reconstruct the path. This isn't sabotage, it's adaptation. People build smaller circles because the larger environment feels too noisy, too slow, or too exposed to be productive. They create local clarity, but the price of that clarity is organizational opacity, and that is an incredibly expensive trade-off to make. Collaboration might still exist, but trust no longer scales. That is the line I want you to hold on to. The team is still working together, but the conditions that allow for broader confidence and decision speed are quietly degrading. A few people know exactly what is going on, while most people only understand their tiny fragment of the map. In that kind of environment, the weak ties, the people you don't work with every day, are the first things to disappear. You stop seeing how adjacent teams think, and you lose those small, low-stakes interactions that build familiarity before a real project dependency shows up. Newer employees feel this the most because they can only connect through what is visible, and in this system, the real work is hidden. Onboarding gets thinner, informal learning gets slower, and cross-team trust becomes nearly impossible to build. Escalation paths become fragile because people no longer know who has the context they need outside their immediate circle. I saw this clearly in one organization where the shared platform and standard channels looked perfect on paper, but the behavioral structure told a different story. The visible structure showed one united organization, while the actual interaction patterns showed dozens of disconnected islands. Systems do not run on official diagrams. They run on how people actually interact. If the pattern is private and fragmented, then the organization is much more disconnected than leadership realizes. This is where visibility and psychological safety intersect, because people only contribute openly when they trust the audience and believe their words won't be used against them. When the system becomes opaque, open contribution feels like a risk, so people retreat further into their trusted circles. That loop reinforces itself until the organization starts producing isolation as a structural feature. It's not that the people are antisocial, it's that the environment rewards contained trust over distributed trust. Contained trust is fast, but distributed trust is resilient, and most organizations accidentally optimize for the one that makes them brittle. What looks like harmless channel behavior is actually the beginning of a massive cohesion problem where knowledge is locked away and reuse drops because work can't be found. The system looks productive, but it is becoming more fragile every day. When shared systems stop reflecting how work actually happens, smart people do what they've always done. They build around them. Pattern 3. App sprawl and local optimization. When people start building their own solutions around a failing system, a very specific pattern emerges almost immediately. App sprawl. This doesn't happen because your team loves complexity or wants to manage 10 different logins. It happens because they are trying to survive friction. This is where many leaders make a major category mistake by looking at extra tools, unofficial databases, and private AI helpers as a simple compliance issue. While it might be a security risk, structurally it is actually a design signal. Smart people do not root around shared systems just for the sake of it. They bypass the official path when it no longer matches the reality of their daily work. You see this when one team creates a cleaner tracker because the corporate version is too slow, or another group builds a lightweight power app because the core platform requires too many steps. Someone starts keeping the real project status in an Excel sheet because the official tool is technically accurate but operationally useless for the people actually doing the labor. Each of these local moves makes perfect sense to the person making them. That is exactly why this pattern is so dangerous for an organization. It doesn't look like a breakdown in the moment. Instead, it looks like initiative, autonomy, and proactive problem solving. In small doses, some of it is exactly that, but the system effect is that individuals optimize their own corners while the organization disconnects globally. Every workaround improves one person's immediate environment while making the wider operating picture harder to see and much harder to trust. As the software stack gets wider, the shared context gets thinner, and the real work becomes less legible to anyone outside that specific bubble. We need to understand shadow IT and shadow AI for what they truly are. These are not just signs of bad discipline or a lack of training. They are clear indicators that the designed environment is not capable of carrying the work people are actually trying to do. Behavior tells the truth much faster than policy ever will. And if people repeatedly bypass the official channel, it means that channel isn't solving the real problem. If your teams keep building local automations and private knowledge stores, your architecture has a fit problem. If you only respond to this with tighter controls and more restrictions, you usually just drive the fragmentation deeper underground where you can't see it. Now map that structural reality to the feeling of loneliness. If your work lives inside your own local stack, your relationship to the wider organization fundamentally changes. You stop depending on shared structures and start relying on your personal workaround layer, which includes your own tools, your own saved prompts, and your own small trust circle. This creates a high level of individual competence, but it also creates deep isolation. Autonomy without a shared architecture is not actually freedom. It is separation. The person becomes more productive in their specific lane, but less connected to the broader system that is supposed to surround them. Once enough people do this at the same time, the organization stops behaving like a single environment and starts acting like a federation of local operating systems with no interoperability. From a systems perspective, that is incredibly fragile. You lose the ability to reuse work because nobody knows what already exists, and you lose visibility because the official platform no longer reflects the real flow of work. Trust begins to erode because every handoff now includes uncertainty about where the data came from or who actually owns the truth. Social connection suffers because more effort is spent navigating tool boundaries than building a shared understanding across them. I saw this clearly in teams where talented people looked highly empowered on paper, but functionally they were carrying their own portable infrastructure just to stay afloat. They had their own side automations and context libraries because that was the only way to make the machine usable. Because they were competent, leadership interpreted this as innovation, but from a structural view, it was pure compensation. The system had delegated the job of coherence to the individual. That is never a stable design for a business. It means the organization is extracting integration labor from its people without ever naming it as labor. App sprawl is not just a tooling problem. It is a human architecture problem that tells you exactly where friction is too high and where people have started solving the need for belonging with local control. The work still gets done, and sometimes it even happens faster, but the cost shows up in other places. You see more app switching, more invisible dependencies, and more context trapped in people instead of platforms. This creates work that cannot be easily handed over or understood by someone outside the immediate circle, and once that becomes the norm, the way decisions are made starts to change too. From collaboration to coordination. Now try to map all three of these patterns together. When async overload, private fragmentation, and app sprawl start reinforcing each other, the operating model shifts in a very specific and damaging way. Teams stop truly collaborating and start spending the majority of their energy on coordination labor. This shift is easy to miss because the calendar still looks busy, but being busy is not the same thing as being collaborative. Collaboration is when people build understanding together to create something that none of them could have produced alone. Coordination is different. It is what happens when fragmented pieces have to be aligned after the fact through more updates, more sequencing, and more stakeholder management. Some coordination is always necessary, but when it starts replacing collaboration, the team begins consuming its own capacity just to stay coherent. I see this constantly in mature hybrid teams where the meeting load goes up, not because the work is harder, but because trust and shared context have become so thin. People need more touch points just to feel safe moving forward. More people are included in every call because fewer people believe the system will catch what they cannot see. So every decision gets wrapped in layers of extra alignment. That is a system outcome. It isn't a sign of indecisiveness or weak talent. It is a trust compression problem. Once shared context falls, explanation loops begin to multiply. You explain the same thing in a call, then in a chat, then in an email, and then again to an adjacent team that wasn't in the first conversation. The content stays the same, but the coordination cost keeps rising because the system cannot carry clarity forward on its own. People end up carrying that clarity manually. Usually, it is the same high performers who become the translation layers between disconnected groups. They are the ones who know how finance speaks, what leadership actually meant in a vague message, and which channel holds the current truth. They step in to translate and bridge the gaps, which looks like leadership, but it is actually a warning sign. It means the system now depends on human glue more than shared architecture. I remember sitting in rooms where everyone was technically aligned, but nobody was actually confident in the path forward. The conversation kept circling because people were compensating for missing trust and needed repetition to create a sense of safety. They needed more witnesses and more validation because there was not enough relational capital to actually make a decision. That is what low social capital work feels like. Everything takes more handling, and the people doing that handling start getting tired in ways the system doesn't even measure. This is also where the phrase, "just get it done," becomes dangerous. On the surface, it sounds pragmatic and businesslike, but when that phrase becomes the dominant norm, it usually means the environment is no longer giving people enough space to think together. They bypass reflection and move straight into patching, which causes shortcuts to increase and cross-functional curiosity to drop. The goal becomes motion instead of understanding. That works for a short while, but it quietly degrades the team's ability to adapt to new challenges. Collaboration creates a shared memory that compounds over time, while coordination only creates temporary alignment that expires and has to be repeated. Over time, the team starts feeling heavier even when the headcount stays exactly the same. You see more meetings, more status labor, and more checking whether a piece of information is still true. Because all of that happens around the work rather than inside the visible deliverable, leaders often underestimate how much energy it is actually consuming. The machine keeps moving, but it needs more human force to move the same distance. That is the hidden cost of shifting from collaboration to coordination. Once a team enters that mode, the business impact stops being subtle and starts affecting everything you build. Decision latency as a social capital problem, and this is where the business impact stops being subtle. Because once collaboration has been replaced by coordination, decisions start slowing down in ways most organizations misdiagnose. Leaders usually blame process or governance or too many stakeholders or unclear ownership, and while those things can be part of it, the deeper issue is often much simpler. The organization has lost social compression. Trust is a compression layer. When trust is strong, people need fewer meetings and fewer explanatory loops because they can move with partial information by trusting the judgment and intent of those around them. This does not mean they are being careless with the business. It means the social fabric is strong enough to carry part of the decision load. When trust is weak, all of that has to be rebuilt manually every single time. So even ordinary decisions start expanding. A straightforward call turns into a sequence of alignment rituals, starting with a pre-call to test reactions and followed by the actual meeting, which then leads to follow-up messages to clarify what was actually meant. Then comes the side conversation with the group that felt left out, the deck revision so the wording feels safer, and finally a sign-off meeting because nobody wants to carry the risk alone. From the outside, that can look like diligence, but often it is just low social capital expressed as operating drag. The reason is simple. Without trust, every decision needs more social proof. Without shared context, every choice needs more explanation. Without psychological safety, every disagreement feels more expensive, so people pull in extra witnesses and extra approval paths to protect themselves. That is how loneliness enters decision-making. It doesn't show up as an emotion first. It shows up as friction. It is the absence of enough human connection to let judgment travel efficiently through the organization. This is why companies can have more tools, more dashboards, and more AI support while still feeling slower than ever. The technical infrastructure improves while the relational infrastructure degrades, which means the organization gains information but loses actual throughput. That trade is rarely visible on a quarterly slide, but you can feel it in the time it takes to get anything meaningful across the line. I've seen teams with excellent reporting and terrible decision velocity, not because they lacked intelligence, but because every decision had become a mini governance event. People no longer trusted that others understood the full picture or that concerns could be raised safely, so they compensated with process theater. More people got copied on emails, More caveats were added to every slide. More language was designed specifically to prevent blame later. That is not just bureaucracy. It is a social defense mechanism. And once that becomes normal, the cost compounds fast. Decisions take longer. Reversals become more common because alignment was never real, only temporary. Smaller issues escalate upward because nobody feels safe making a call below the line. Managers spend more time translating and less time leading. Senior people become bottlenecks simply because they are the only ones with enough cross-system trust to compress ambiguity. Again, high performers absorb this first. They know how to get the pre-alignment done and who needs a quiet call before the visible decision happens. Because they know where trust is weak and where reassurance is needed, they become the speed layer for a system that has lost its own native speed. That works until they get tired or leave. And then suddenly, leadership discovers the business was not moving because the system was healthy. It was moving because a handful of people were manually maintaining the decision flow. That is why I would translate loneliness very directly for executives. Loneliness slows the business before it ever shows up in attrition. It reduces decision quality because honest challenge becomes rarer. It increases risk because weak trust pushes issues underground until they become expensive. And it raises operating costs because more hours are spent producing agreement than producing progress. So if decisions in your organization feel strangely heavy despite all the tooling, I would look beyond workflow and ask a harder question. Where has social capital thinned so much that ordinary choices now require extraordinary alignment? The shadow system response. Once decision latency becomes normal, people do what people always do inside a slow system. They root around it, not because they are rebellious, because the business still has to move. This is the part leaders usually notice too late. They see the official platform, the approved process, and the documented workflow, and then they assume that is where the work is actually happening. But the real work starts drifting somewhere else. It moves into private chats. It moves into side documents. It moves into copied spreadsheets and duplicated trackers. It moves into small AI experiments nobody wants to mention yet because asking for permission feels slower than just solving the problem. That is the shadow system response. And I want to be very precise here. Shadow systems are not random mess. They are structural compensation. They appear when the formal environment creates too much friction for the pace of real work, so people create an unofficial layer that feels lighter and more usable. A chat thread becomes the real decision channel, a shared document outside the main space becomes the true source of status, and a private copilot workflow becomes the way to generate summaries because the official process cannot carry context cleanly. So the platform says one thing, behavior says another, and behavior is usually telling the truth. The reason this matters is that shadow IT and shadow AI are often framed as governance failures first, but most of the time they are design failures first. They signal that the official system may be compliant and technically available, but it is not actually aligned with how people need to work under pressure. So they build around it. And from a system perspective, that tells us something important. The organization is no longer producing trust in the shared environment. It is producing workarounds. That has consequences. First, auditability drops, not because people are hiding bad intent, but because the real sequence of decisions now lives across too many partial surfaces. A side chat here and a copied file there means that when someone tries to understand why a call was made later, the organization has fragments instead of history. Second, reuse drops. Good work gets trapped in local pockets. A useful automation stays inside one team, and a prompt pattern that actually works stays in one manager's private folder, which means a smart workaround never becomes a shared capability because it was built to survive local friction rather than strengthen the wider architecture. Third, trust gets weaker, not stronger. Because once people know the official system is no longer the real system, every handoff contains more doubt. They start wondering if they are seeing the latest version or if they are seeing the actual context instead of a cleaned up version that arrived after 5 invisible decisions already took place. That uncertainty is exhausting, and it is socially expensive, because now every person has to spend extra effort figuring out not just what is true, but where truth lives. This is where the loneliness part becomes very concrete. When the real operating model lives in shadows, belonging becomes local. You trust the people who know your shortcuts and your hidden channels, but your connection to the wider organization gets thinner, because the wider organization is no longer where clarity lives. It is just the formal surface. So the person becomes more embedded in a microsystem and less embedded in the company as a whole. That is not empowerment. That is fragmentation with a productivity veneer. I've seen this happen in organizations that looked digitally mature from the outside. They had strong platform investments and clear governance language. But once you talk to the people inside the work, the truth was obvious. The official environment was the presentation layer, while the shadow environment was the operating layer. And when those two drift too far apart, leaders lose sight of how the business actually functions. That creates a dangerous illusion. The system looks governed, but it is only governable in theory. In practice, it depends on invisible patches, informal trust circles, and unofficial context paths to stay alive, which means the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's just not doing what the business now needs. And eventually that strain shows up where leaders finally can't ignore it anymore. Why high performers leave first. Eventually, the structural strain of a disconnected environment shows up in your attrition numbers, but it rarely happens the way most leaders expect. Many organizations explain away high performer exits using very clean, professional language. They talk about better opportunities, higher pay, or a need for a different challenge. While those reasons are sometimes true, if you look closely at a system that has relied on hidden human compensation for too long, the exit tells a much deeper story. The structure simply stopped sustaining the person who was carrying it. I focus on high performers because they are usually the first people to feel the full weight of a badly designed environment. They are the ones doing the invisible labor that keeps the department functional. They hold the extra context, bridge the gaps where trust is weak, and translate goals across different teams. These individuals don't just finish their own tasks, they stabilize everyone else's work by buffering confusion for managers and stakeholders alike. Because they are so effective at this, the organization begins to treat that extra load as the baseline. This doesn't happen formally through a job description, but it happens behaviorally every single day. People go to them because they know problems get solved faster, and leaders rely on them because they reduce the overall noise in the system. Cross-functional projects find them because they speak multiple organizational languages fluently. Over time, the high performer stops being a strong contributor and starts functioning as a structural compensator. That role is incredibly expensive, and I don't just mean in terms of hours worked. It costs them their identity. The person starts living in a state of permanent translation, always carrying more than their official title requires. They manage more emotional regulation and more unspoken risk than anyone realizes. This is exactly where loneliness and burnout start to feed on each other. From the outside, the person looks incredibly valuable, but on the inside, they feel increasingly isolated because so few people understand the true shape of the load they are bearing. Everyone sees the high-quality output, but almost nobody sees the load-bearing function happening behind the scenes. That gap is dangerous. Once a person feels that their contribution is essential but completely invisible, their commitment becomes brittle. They might still care about the mission and deliver great results, but inwardly their perspective begins to narrow. You can usually see this shift long before the official resignation letter arrives. You'll notice less mentoring of junior staff, less spontaneous help offered to other teams, and a sudden lack of challenge in high-stakes meetings. They stop offering the surplus energy that healthy systems often mistake for personality. They stop investing in the wider environment because that environment no longer feels reciprocal or sustainable. This isn't laziness or typical disengagement, it is protective withdrawal. From a system perspective, this is a clear signal that the organization is draining its structural resilience faster than it can replenish it. And I've seen this pattern in teams where leaders were genuinely shocked when a top person quit, because on the surface, nothing looked broken. The person was respected, visible, and performing at a high level, but those exact conditions are what make the exit so easy to miss. The individual became so competent at carrying the strain that nobody bothered to read the strain itself. When they finally leave, the resignation is framed as a move for ambition, when it was actually a mix of exhaustion and disconnection. It wasn't just burnout from hard work. It was burnout from constant compensation in an environment where the quality of connection was too low to make the effort feel worth it. In uncertain markets, job hugging complicates this even further. People don't always leave the moment a structure becomes unhealthy. Instead, they stay, narrow their focus, and manage their exposure. On the outside, it looks like loyalty, but on the inside, the relationship has already ended. By the time the exit actually happens, the real loss occurred months ago. The mentoring had already dropped, the cross-team glue had weakened, and the team was already becoming more fragile while that person's name was still on the org chart. If your strongest people are leaving, don't just view it as a talent problem. Ask what kind of structure requires your best people to reconnect the organization by hand just to make normal work possible. If that is what you call performance, then the resignation isn't the first failure, it's just the moment the system can no longer hide the truth. The breakpoint. When one person leaves, the breakpoint rarely arrives with a dramatic collapse or a public failure where everyone admits the system is broken. Instead, it arrives quietly, as a single resignation. At first, leadership usually views this as a manageable hurdle. They plan to backfill the role, reassign a few tasks, and hold the transition together for a quarter while they document a few processes. On paper, that sounds like a reasonable way to handle a departure, but this is exactly where the underlying architecture gets exposed. When a key person exits a socially compressed system, you aren't just losing labor, you are losing hidden infrastructure. You lose the memory of why specific decisions were made and the trust paths between groups that don't naturally talk to each other. The informal escalation routes and the translation layer between the official process and the actual work simply vanish. The quiet judgment about what matters right now and who needs to be involved is gone, and none of that sits on an organizational chart. That is why the loss always feels bigger than the job description suggests. I remember a team that looked perfectly stable until one person left. They weren't the most senior person or the loudest voice in the room, but once they were gone, the pace of the entire department changed instantly. Questions started circulating longer, and decisions that used to take a day suddenly stretched into a week. Two teams realized they had been working on completely different assumptions for months because the coordination they relied on was being done manually by that one individual. Suddenly, everyone started saying the same thing. I didn't realize they were holding all of that. That sentence is a massive red flag. If one departure reveals how much context was never structurally distributed, then your team wasn't resilient, it was dependent. Dependency always looks like efficiency until the system is actually tested. In technical architecture, if one node goes down and the whole service fails, we call that a single point of failure. We recognize that redundancy was missing and that resilience was assumed rather than designed. Human systems deserve that same level of honesty. If one person leaves and knowledge sharing slows down while ownership blurs and duplicated work rises, you have a concentration risk. Every team has people who matter, but the real issue is whether their contribution is surrounded by enough structural support to absorb change. In fragile teams, one person usually holds the social map and the bridge between stakeholders. They are the only ones who know where the truth lives across 5 different tools and 3 different chat channels. They know how to calm friction before it turns into a visible conflict. Once they leave, the hidden cost of all that local optimization hits the balance sheet at once. You see more rework, more hesitation, and more meetings just to recreate the context that used to be carried by memory and trust. Leaders often underestimate the emotional impact of this loss. When a key person exits, the people left behind suddenly feel the fragility of the system they've been living in. Confidence drops because the unofficial failover path is gone, and the absence makes the poor design visible to everyone. Once the design is visible, people realize how much of their speed depended on personal heroics rather than a shared structure. This realization changes how people behave. They get more cautious, pull more people into every decision, and start documenting things reactively because the environment no longer feels safe. The departure of one person doesn't just show you where the fragility is, it actually amplifies it. The team slows down, not because the remaining people are weak, but because the system was optimized without any redundancy. It had confused high performance with actual resilience. That is the real breakpoint. It isn't just about burnout or attrition. It's the moment a human exit reveals that what looked like organizational strength was actually just dependency held together by invisible, unsustainable effort. Structural resilience versus performative performance. Once the breakpoint becomes visible, we can finally name the real distinction that has been hiding underneath this entire story. It is the difference between performance and resilience, or more precisely, the gap between structural resilience and performative performance. Performative performance is what most organizations reward by default because it looks like visible output, fast response times, and calendars packed with back-to-back meetings. Leaders love this version of work because it is legible on a dashboard and sounds great during quarterly reviews, creating a comforting feeling that the machine is running at full strength. Teams look busy, committed, and under total control, and the people inside them keep delivering no matter what the cost. But here's the thing we have to acknowledge. A lot of what gets recognized as high performance in our current business reality is not actually durable operating strength. It is delayed failure. It is output being maintained through constant overextension, hidden dependencies, and social compression. I use the phrase performative performance not because the work is fake, but because the appearance of health is misleading. The work is real, the effort is exhausting, and the results can be impressive, but the underlying capacity of the system is being quietly consumed to preserve that appearance of consistency. That is not resilience, it is extraction. Structural resilience is a completely different animal. It means the team can absorb pressure without immediately converting that stress into invisible human strain. In a resilient system, context is not concentrated in the heads of 1 or 2 people, and trust is distributed widely enough that work moves without needing constant retranslation. Visibility is high enough that people can find the truth without chasing private Slack channels or relying on someone's personal memory. This means relationships have redundancy, not just processes. That last part is the most important piece of the puzzle. A lot of organizations are great at building backup procedures, but they are terrible at building backup relationships. They document the workflow while ignoring the trust path, and they define ownership without ever building a shared understanding. When stress finally enters the system, the procedure exists on paper, but the human infrastructure needed to carry it out has completely eroded. And why is that? It's because structural resilience is much harder to perform for an audience. You cannot fake it with high-speed busyness or signal it through response times alone. You see it in how a team handles a sudden interruption, or whether a key player can step away for a week without the entire flow collapsing. You see it in whether a disagreement sharpens the final product or simply triggers a round of defensive coordination. From a system perspective, resilient teams share a few clear properties that make them stand out. They have redundancy, meaning more than one person holds critical context at any given time. They have visibility, so the real work is legible to people beyond the immediate inner circle. They also have healthy interaction paths where people know exactly where to raise issues or test ideas without facing excessive social friction. Because those conditions exist, pressure gets absorbed by the structure itself rather than being dumped on the individuals with the highest tolerance for pain. Now map that reality to what many high-performing environments actually do. They celebrate doing more with less and aggressively remove anything that looks non-essential to the bottom line. They compress meetings, overlap, and informal contact, and for a short while that can look incredibly efficient. But often the things they are removing are the very supports that make resilience possible in the first place. They cut the spare relational capacity, the second pair of eyes, and the weak ties that connect different functions. They eliminate the informal contact that turns future coordination into trust, and they shrink the margin that lets teams adapt before they finally crack. The team still performs, but it performs by absorbing damage silently. That is the difference I want leaders to understand. Some teams cope, while other teams compound. A coping team survives pressure by leaning harder on its strongest people until they break, but a resilient team distributes that pressure through design so that no single person has to become the failover system. If you remember nothing else from this discussion, remember that visible output is not proof of structural health. Sometimes high output is just proof that the people inside the system are compensating faster than the system is learning. This is why loneliness belongs in an operational conversation rather than just a well-being one. When connection is weak, resilience is weak, and when resilience is weak, your continuity becomes fragile. The executive question is no longer whether the team is performing. The real question is what kind of performance you are actually producing. Is it the kind that looks good this quarter while draining the people holding it together, or is it the kind that can sustain pressure without quietly breaking the humans inside the machine? What the research actually says. Now let's bring in the research to validate this pattern. The data is strong, and it shows that burnout in tech and hybrid work is not just an occasional people problem. It is a structural condition tied to overload, fragmentation, and degraded connection. One study on systemic burnout reports that over 75% of workers show symptoms, and in the developer community, that number reaches as high as 80%. That language is important because it matches the system outcome we've been tracing. This isn't isolated stress, it's a predictable result of how we've built our environments. The same pattern appears in research on social connection, where studies show that remote work hasn't destroyed social capital, but it has completely redefined it. This stops us from making the lazy argument that remote work itself is the problem. The real issue is whether organizations intentionally rebuild connection or just assume it will happen on its own. When you look at social capital research, the picture gets even sharper. Studies consistently separate bonding ties, which are the strong relationships inside close groups, from bridging ties, which are the weaker links that allow innovation to move across an organization. Bonding ties can hold for a while, but bridging ties decay much faster in hybrid settings if they aren't actively supported. When those bridging ties drop, the organization loses its structural resilience, cross-functional trust thins out, and innovation has a harder time scaling. This is where psychological safety becomes a measurable operational factor. Research shows that remote and hybrid workers can actually report higher psychological safety than those on site, which is a useful correction to the idea that distributed work is always worse. However, when safety is low, burnout and quit intent rise sharply. Among employees with low resilience and low safety, 60% report burnout, which is a staggering number compared to those who feel supported. The mechanism here is not a mystery. If people cannot ask for help, surface doubt, or recover socially inside the team, the strain intensifies at an accelerated rate. The resilience research reinforces this link. In one major model, employee resilience and supportive practices explain nearly half of the variance in organizational resilience. That isn't soft language. It is a direct structural link between human conditions and business outcomes. Finally, the research on async work and digital overload gives us one more layer of reality. Studies point to rising context switching and the triple peak workday as recurring patterns that drain energy. While async work can reduce meeting load, it often stretches the workday and weakens cohesion without clear relational safeguards. People end up being always in touch but never truly connected, and social isolation remains a challenge, even in highly productive environments. If we step back and look at the full picture, the research tells us that loneliness isn't an individual failing. Connection, trust, and safety are not side benefits of work design. They are the core of work design itself. When those elements are missing, the business doesn't just feel colder to the people inside it, it becomes slower, weaker, and significantly more fragile. The belief break: remote work is not the problem. We need to break a very persistent belief right now: remote work is not the problem. I want to say that plainly because many leaders are still trying to solve loneliness by solving for proximity. They want more office days, mandated presence, and more bodies in rooms. The assumption is simple: if people are physically closer, connection will recover automatically. But that assumption confuses access with environment, and those are not the same thing. Offices used to create a kind of accidental redundancy through hallway conversations and unplanned clarifications. You had casual contact that reduced friction before it turned into a formal process, and there were more chances for weak ties to form without anyone designing them. That part was real, but here is the thing. Many organizations lost those conditions long before they lost the physical office. Most companies had already optimized for speed and visibility inside the building, leading to more calendar density and transactional interaction. People were practicing performance signaling and working next to each other without actually working with each other. When leaders say we need people back to reconnect, I think the more honest question is reconnect to what? If the underlying environment is built around overload and fragmented trust, bringing people physically closer does not fix the architecture. It just changes the location of the strain. Research shows that remote and hybrid workers often report higher psychological safety than on-site workers, which is an inconvenient fact for anyone wanting a simple return-to-office answer. It tells us the issue is not distance, but whether the environment allows people to speak honestly and build trust in a usable way. Behavior wasn't driven by access, it was driven by environment. If the environment rewards interruption and constant responsiveness, people will adapt in that direction, whether they are at home or in headquarters. When the environment rewards open visibility and healthy boundaries, people will adapt to that too, even across a great distance. From a system perspective, remote work did not create the loneliness problem from nothing. It simply exposed which organizations had been relying on accidental structure instead of intentional design. The office had been masking design weakness by supplying social spillover for free. It provided incidental trust and small context repairs through moments of human compression that stopped every issue from needing a workflow. Once distributed work removed that default layer, companies discovered they had never actually built digital environments that could replace it. The failure was not remote work, but removing one form of connection infrastructure without building another. Forcing presence often feels unsatisfying to the people inside the system because they sense the invitation is not really about better connection. It is often about recreating a coordination mechanism the organization does not know how to design intentionally, and that won't hold. The answer is not more presence, it is better connection architecture. We need fewer meaningless check-ins, clearer norms, and more visible work. Hybrid time should be used for ambiguity and trust building, not just status updates that could have been a message. If leaders miss this, they treat loneliness like a location problem instead of a structural one. Some offices produce belonging, while others only produce proximity. Those are not the same asset. Remote work is not inherently isolating, and office work is not inherently connecting. Both are just containers. What matters is the quality of interaction paths inside them and whether the environment creates trust faster than it creates friction. Once you see that, the executive task changes completely. You stop asking how to get people back and start asking what kind of environment you are asking them to log into every day. If the design is wrong, the location won't save it, and AI is now about to amplify whatever environment already exists. Why AI makes the loneliness system worse? AI enters this environment like an accelerant rather than a root cause. It is a force multiplier. If your organization has weak shared context and overloaded channels, AI does not arrive as a neutral layer. It lands inside the existing architecture and starts scaling whatever is already there. If the environment is coherent, AI can help. But if the environment is fragmented, AI helps that fragmentation move faster. Many leaders still underestimate this because they treat AI as a capability deployment problem involving licenses and training. AI value is not produced by access alone. It depends on whether the human environment has enough relational stability to turn output into coordinated action. Otherwise, what you get is solitary acceleration. A person writes faster and summarizes faster, but they do more of that work alone. One of the hidden functions of older work patterns was that they forced human contact. You had to ask someone for help. AI removes that friction, but when the organization is already low on connection, removing friction also removes the interaction points that maintain shared meaning. The person becomes faster, but the collective becomes thinner. This is why AI can intensify loneliness without anyone noticing at first. Output goes up and the dashboards look better, but the natural reasons to engage another human get replaced by a machine that is always available and never tired. Instead of asking the team, people ask the tool. They draft privately and polish work in isolation instead of surfacing half-formed thinking early. Human-AI interaction starts substituting for human-human interaction in an environment that was already underconnected. That is a system outcome. This links directly to burnout because AI often increases pace and fills the time it supposedly frees. People do not simply get time back, they get more expectations and more work enters their lane. The worker is no longer just doing their role faster. They are often doing a wider role, what feels like empowerment at first, before it becomes intensification. When intensification happens inside a low connection environment, the person has even fewer natural recovery points. The work becomes more continuous and self-contained, which sounds productive but is structurally isolating. Tools like Copilot work best when the organization has usable data and shared patterns, but if information is fragmented, the AI inherits that fragmentation. The tool is often just revealing the condition of the environment beneath it. Low trust and weak knowledge flow mean the AI is only as connected as the organization itself. Failed AI adoption is a social architecture problem before it is a technical one. If your environment lacks relational infrastructure, AI will not create collective intelligence. It will create faster local intelligence and more productivity at the edges with less coherence at the center. Loneliness does not disappear under AI, it just becomes easier to hide. A person can keep producing and appear highly functional while becoming even more operationally alone inside the work. That is not augmentation, it is structural compensation with better tooling. If leaders want AI to create real value, they have to ask what kind of human environment this technology is amplifying and what leaders should measure instead. If AI amplifies the environment, then leaders need a better way to read that environment. This is where most measurement fails today because organizations are still obsessed with measuring activity. They track messages sent, meetings attended, response speeds, and how many tasks were closed. These numbers are easy to collect and even easier to put into a slide deck for a board meeting, but they tell you nothing about whether the system is building connection or quietly draining it. I make a very specific distinction here. Activity metrics tell you that traffic exists, while resilience metrics tell you if the road network will actually hold up under pressure. If you want to know if loneliness is becoming a structural business risk, you have to stop looking for signs of busyness and start looking for signals of fragility. For example, you should measure bridging ties. I am not talking about using surveillance to turn people into data points for punishment, but rather understanding if connections exist across different teams and functions. If the same small circles do all the work while cross-functional links keep thinning, your social redundancy is already dropping. When an organization collapses into isolated clusters, it loses the ability to adapt because the information flow has been cut off at the borders. Then you need to measure visibility. You should ask how much critical work is happening in private channels and how much context is trapped in direct messages or local apps instead of shared spaces. If private coordination grows faster than shared coordination, it isn't just a personal preference. It is a clear sign that the common environment no longer feels usable or safe enough for real work. Decision friction is another vital signal. You can track how many touch points a simple decision needs before it moves, or how often decisions are reopened because the initial alignment was shallow. When people feel they need to copy 20 stakeholders on an email just to feel safe acting, you aren't looking at a governance problem. You are looking at trust compression breaking down in real time. I would also watch bottleneck concentration very closely. You need to identify where context accumulates and which specific people repeatedly become the unofficial translators or approval layers for the company. If the same 3 names appear every time ambiguity needs to be resolved, you aren't seeing leadership strength, you are seeing a hidden dependency that creates a single point of failure. Then there is the cost of rework. When multiple teams solve the same problem in parallel without knowing it, or different tools hold different versions of the same truth, fragmentation becomes an operational expense. Once the environment stops carrying context cleanly, the business starts paying for that failure through duplicated effort and slower coordination. Psychological safety matters here too, but you have to measure it in a way that connects to operating reality. You should ask if people can raise concerns early or challenge assumptions without creating social risk for themselves. If they don't believe their view counts until after a decision is already made, you should expect slower decisions and more expensive issues surfacing far too late. We also have to distinguish engagement from performative responsiveness. Fast replies can mean commitment, but they can also mean boundary erosion, fear, and a state of permanent partial attention. High meeting attendance might look like involvement, but it often means the system no longer trusts itself to move without witnesses present. The thing most people miss is that the goal is not more communication volume, it is more connection capacity. You want an environment that creates trust and coordinated action without having to manually extract that coherence from a handful of tired people. Leaders should measure whether the design helps people stay connected to each other in ways that support judgment and resilience. If your metrics only see activity, you will keep rewarding the very patterns that make the business more fragile. Redesign principle 1, make work more visible. If we want to reduce loneliness at work structurally, the first move isn't a culture memo, it's visibility. In fragmented environments, people are disconnected from the actual shape of the work and cannot see who is doing what or how their effort connects to the bigger picture. When work becomes hard to see, trust becomes expensive, and visibility is the only way to lower that cost. I am not talking about surveillance. Surveillance asks if leadership can see the person, but visibility asks if the people inside the work can see enough of the work to coordinate without constant manual repair. That is the standard we should aim for. In practical terms, this means moving toward an open by default way of working. Some work is sensitive and some relationships need protected space, but in many companies, private has become the default simply because the shared environment feels too noisy or politically risky. If the common space is not useful, people will naturally root around it. Leaders have to make the common space usable again by fixing the information architecture. You have to define where the work lives and where the context goes after a meeting ends. If the answers vary by team or by whoever started the project, then visibility is still too dependent on local behavior. People should not need insider knowledge or special social standing just to find the current reality of a project. This is where simple decision logs become a powerful tool. A basic record of what was decided, why it happened, and who owns the next move reduces an enormous amount of social friction. It stops decisions from disappearing into side chats and gives the organization a shared reference point. These shared points reduce loneliness because they reduce the amount of private chasing required just to stay oriented. The same logic applies to your communication channels. If key work happens in private messages, the organization is teaching people that progress depends on being in the right hidden room. This produces exclusion even when nobody intends any harm. The fix isn't banning private chat, but making shared channels good enough that people actually want to use them. That requires clearer naming, stronger ownership, and less channel chaos. You need norms around bringing important context back into the visible layer once an insight matters to others. Visibility is trust infrastructure because it tells people they don't need special access to understand what is happening. It makes contribution and risk legible before someone has to escalate emotionally just to be heard. I have seen teams improve not by working harder, but by making their work easier to follow. When the environment starts carrying more context on its own, you suddenly need fewer clarification meetings and fewer status chases. A visible system is not just easier to manage, it is much easier to belong inside. Once people can see where the work is and where they fit, they no longer have to stay socially overconnected just to remain operationally informed. They can trust the environment more, and when that happens, the pressure on personal access finally drops. If you want to start somewhere, audit one team today and ask where the real work is happening and where people are still relying on private access to understand the truth. The first move in redesigning loneliness out of a system is making the work visible enough that connection does not depend on insider status. Redesign principle 2. Build redundancy into human systems. Once you make the work visible, your next move is to build redundancy. This is where many leaders start to feel uncomfortable because redundancy sounds like a lack of efficiency if you are still stuck in a pure optimization mindset. It sounds like overlap, extra costs, or too many people knowing the same thing. You might worry that you are spending too much time involving people who are not strictly necessary for a specific task. But if you look at this from a resilience perspective, redundancy is never waste. It is protection against a total system collapse. We understand this logic instinctively when we deal with technical systems. We would never build critical infrastructure with only one recovery path and then act surprised when a single failure spreads through the whole network. To prevent that, we add backup capacity, we distribute the load, and we work hard to avoid single points of failure. But when we look at human systems, many organizations do the exact opposite. They centralize all the context in one expert, one manager, or one project lead, and then they call that efficiency. It is not efficiency. It is concentration risk wearing a productivity badge. True human redundancy means much more than just having a backup person listed on an organizational chart. It means more than just having good documentation too. Documentation matters, but a static file cannot fully replace the relational pathways through which work actually moves in the real world. A PDF cannot hold trust the way a network of real working relationships can, and it certainly cannot absorb ambiguity the way 2 or 3 people with shared context can. If your only backup strategy consists of files and folders, you do not have redundancy yet, you just have a collection of artifacts. Real redundancy lives inside relationships, shared context, and decision pathways. More than one person needs to understand the moving parts of critical work so the system doesn't stop when a single person leaves. You need multiple people who are trusted across team boundaries, and more than one person should be able to carry a decision forward without hitting the same bottleneck every single time. That is what a resilient human architecture actually looks like. So how do you start building it? There are a few specific ways that matter more than the rest. First, you need to start cross-team pairing. Do not treat this as a forced social exercise, but rather as a structural habit where people solve real problems with someone outside their immediate circle. This creates bridge strength while the stakes are still manageable, and it stops expertise from becoming trapped inside a single lane. If collaboration only happens when there is already a crisis, the bridge you are trying to build will arrive too late to help. Second, you should rotate ownership in controlled ways. I'm not talking about creating chaos or constant reshuffling, but rather just enough movement so that context does not harden around one person forever. Let someone else run the weekly review, let another person lead the stakeholder thread, and let decisions be explained by more than one voice. This clicked for me when I realized how many teams used the phrase clear ownership when what they really meant was that nobody else knew how the work actually functioned. That is not ownership, that is a dangerous dependency. Third, you have to build weak ties on purpose. This is the point where people think I am drifting into soft culture language, but I am actually talking about operational assets. Weak ties are the low-friction paths where context, trust, and help can travel before you ever need a formal escalation. If every relationship in your organization is either very close or basically non-existent, the system becomes brittle because there is no middle layer or spare route to take when the pressure rises. Managers play a massive role in this process. A manager is not just there to assign work and monitor performance, because a good manager shapes the interaction patterns that allow trust to scale. They decide who meets whom, who gets exposed to which decision, and who gains enough context to grow beyond their current lane. If managers only optimize for local throughput, they might improve short-term output while they quietly strip the team of its future resilience. You also have to protect informal learning. This is usually the first thing to get cut in hard-driving environments because it looks optional to the untrained eye. It's the quick question, the shared walkthrough, the second voice in the room, or the conversation that happens right after the meeting ends. Those small exchanges are exactly where redundancy starts forming, because that is where people learn how others think instead of just what they do. In a way, this is the business version of what I call your friend's net worth. It isn't about popularity or networking theater. It is about the structural resilience of your human connection model. If one path fails, do other paths still exist to get the job done? When one person leaves the company, does the context stay behind or does it move out the door with them? If the pressure rises, can support travel across the system without everything having to escalate upward to the top? That is the real test of your design. If you want one practical move today, audit your most critical workflows and ask yourself 3 simple questions. Where is the context concentrated? Where is the trust concentrated? And where would the system slow down immediately if one specific person disappeared for 30 days? Those answers will show you exactly where your redundancy is missing. Once that redundancy is in place, the final move is not just about distributing people better, but about protecting the environment where those connections can keep forming. Redesign principle 3. Create intentional connection points. Once visibility improves and redundancy starts to exist, your next move is to create intentional connection points. This makes a lot of organizations nervous because they assume it means more meetings, more check-ins, or more low-value culture theater dressed up as care. That is not what I am suggesting. I am talking about designing specific moments where trust, context, and healthy challenge can actually take root. If you remove all unstructured human contact from a high-pressure environment, the system will still communicate, but it will stop metabolizing uncertainty. It will pass tasks around and move information from point A to point B, but it will struggle with ambiguity and learning. Those things require much richer contact than a simple stream of digital updates can ever provide. So the question is not how to get people talking more. The real question is where we need human contact, because the work itself becomes better when people think together. That is a design question. And why is that? It's because not every interaction deserves your real-time energy, and things like status updates or routine approvals usually do not require a live meeting. If those administrative tasks consume all your best overlap time, your system is wasting the very moments that could have built shared judgment. Intentional connection points should be reserved for work that actually benefits from human depth. I'm talking about ambiguity, trade-offs, conflict, and mentoring. Those are the places where connection stops being a social extra and becomes part of your operating infrastructure. In practical terms, this means having fewer meaningless check-ins and more purposeful contact across different functions. You need fewer meetings where 10 people narrate a slide deck that everyone already read, and more sessions where unresolved questions actually get worked through. You want moments where people see how their colleagues think, not just a list of what they have completed. For hybrid teams, this matters even more than usual. If people are coming together physically, you must use that time for relationship-rich work, like trust building or strategic design. Do not burn that expensive time on performative presence and status recaps, because if office time looks just like a dashboard review, people will correctly see it as wasted bandwidth. The same logic applies in remote settings. Intentional connection does not require a physical room, but it does require a very clear purpose. A well-designed remote environment can still create strong connection points if leaders are deliberate about where live interaction matters and where asynchronous work should carry the load. That balance is often much healthier for the system, using async for clarity and sync for complexity. That is a better architecture than dragging everything into one mode and hoping the culture survives the strain. This is also where your norms matter a lot. If every ping feels urgent, the quality of the connection drops immediately. If everyone is permanently reachable, no one has enough mental depth left for real engagement with their peers. When calendars are packed wall to wall, every human interaction starts arriving in a depleted state, which is why protecting deep work is not separate from protecting connection. It actually supports it. People who have room to think arrive at meetings differently, and they ask better questions because they aren't just rushing to the next deadline. This is the part many leaders miss. Connection is not built only by adding social moments to the calendar. It is also built by removing the environmental conditions that make human interaction feel thin, rushed, and transactional. You have to design calmer pathways, clear response windows, and fewer overlapping channels. That is not a soft approach to business. It is speed infrastructure. A team with real connection points adapts faster, escalates problems earlier, and disagrees with much less damage to the relationship. They integrate tools like AI more intelligently because the people still have a place to compare their judgment rather than just generating more output. If you want one practical move here, audit your current interaction model and ask yourself this. Which of your meetings actually build trust, clarity, or learning? Which ones only exist to preserve the appearance of activity? And where does important human contact need to happen that currently has no place in your designs? Start there. Because if loneliness is a structural issue, then connection cannot be left to chance. It has to be designed into the places where the work needs it most. What this means for anyone responsible for systems. So let me bring this all the way back to the people who actually shape how work happens. If you are responsible for systems, platforms, operating models, or digital transformation, then this isn't just a HR topic, it is your direct responsibility. Leaders do not simply inherit behavior from their teams. They set the environment that produces that behavior in the first place. Once you start seeing loneliness as a system outcome, you stop treating it like a personal well-being issue and start reading it as an operating condition with massive business effects. Everything changes when the system is misaligned, from decision quality and attrition to the actual value you get out of AI. That is the business reality we are facing today. Many leaders still try to keep human strain in its own little category, putting burnout in one bucket and retention in a separate dashboard, but that is a dangerous way to work. These are not separate problems at all. They are linked outputs coming from the same broken design conditions. When you have low visibility and weak trust paths combined with constant partial attention, the system is going to send you a bill. Sometimes that bill shows up as slower decisions or duplicated work, and other times it looks like shadow systems or quiet quitting. You might not notice it until one key person leaves and exposes how dependent the entire team had become on their manual effort, but it is always the same bill. This is exactly why high performers matter so much in this conversation. They are often your first warning signal, not because they are fragile, but because they are the ones who compensate for system failure the longest. They absorb the ambiguity and reconnect fragmented work between teams, carrying the emotional overflow to keep delivery intact while the actual resilience of the organization is thinning out. So when your best people look like they are doing fine, you need to be very careful. They might be keeping the system stable through personal effort that simply does not scale, and if your strongest people are doing that manually, the system is already more fragile than your reporting suggests. That isn't a compliment to their talent, it is a structural warning that your architecture is failing. From a systems perspective, concentration is risk. If all your critical trust and context sits with one manager or one architect who just knows how things work, then your continuity is much weaker than you think. You do not have a resilient organization, you have a high-stakes dependency with good manners, and dependency always feels cheaper until the moment it finally breaks. For anyone responsible for systems, the question is no longer whether loneliness exists in your environment. The real question is whether your architecture is producing conditions where people are forced to compensate for missing connections by hand. Do your people need private chats to get real clarity, or do they rely on specific personalities just to move normal work through the pipeline? If your team needs constant meetings because shared context is too thin, or if they stay overly responsive just to feel visible and safe, then the environment is asking humans to provide structural compensation. That might work for a short while, but eventually it will start draining the people inside the system. This is where your responsibility becomes practical rather than just moral. You don't solve this by telling people to connect more or by scheduling more social hours. You solve it by removing the patterns that make disconnection the default outcome of productive work. You have to redesign where work is visible, reduce fragmentation, and distribute context so that trust-supporting interaction points happen naturally. Leadership in this environment isn't about increasing the volume of communication, it's about building better architecture. The system outcome will continue to be exhaustion and isolation until the design itself changes. If you are in charge of the systems, then you are also in charge of the conditions that determine whether people can sustain their performance without quietly breaking. So here is the practical challenge I want to give you. Pick just one team and audit it for 3 specific signals: async overload, private fragmentation, and local tool workarounds. Then ask yourself one hard question. Where is our output being preserved by hidden human compensation rather than being supported by the structure itself? Once you have that answer, redesign one thing in each category. You don't need to fix the entire organization in one move. You just need to pick one interaction pattern, one visibility gap, and one dependency bottleneck. Make that one structural weakness visible and then take the steps to correct it. That is more than enough to begin the process. Because once connection improves structurally, everything else starts to move faster. Decisions speed up, your AI tools become more usable, and knowledge travels through the organization with much less friction. Most importantly, fewer people will need to act as human failover systems just to keep the normal day-to-day work moving. So that is the real shift. Loneliness at work is not a private weakness you need to manage quietly, but rather a system outcome with direct consequences for your resilience, speed, and business continuity. If you want to hear more conversations like this, make sure to subscribe to the M365 FM podcast. I want to leave you with one final thought. If you audited your connection model the same way you audit your technical systems, what would you find? And more importantly, is that environment actually designed to sustain the people inside it, or is it just slowly draining them over time?